Okay, so we are going to start with the what amounts to basically the last of what we're going to cover this semester, and that's the nervous system. But the nervous system is so important; it really covers three different chapters. So, and three very long chapters. I have to give that to you too. So, spend some time here reading the book, going over the stuff. It's very dense. It's very important. The nervous system regulates everything that's going on in the body. It's the point of communication and instructions and everything for all of the other systems. And it's got quite a bit that goes along with it, along the chemical and along the physiological terms of this. But it does start with chapter 10, and we'll do 11 and 12, and that will be the end of the semester by that point. All right, so let's start with terms, and then we'll move on to some physiology a little bit later. First thing is neurons. Neurons are the cells that we really think of as being nerve cells or being the nervous system. So they're the guys that do all the work. They're the workhorses of the nervous system. But you cannot discount these other cells here. So there's other cells called neuroglial cells, sometimes just referred to as like glial cells or glia cells, but it's all the same thing. It's kind of like just shortening the word. These guys are really, really important because without them, the neurons can't do their work. Their job is to support the neurons, to help the neurons. They're the little helpers. They're the guys that are going to make sure that everything in the environment and everything that is going on with the nervous system and with the neurons themselves is able to occur because they're there to help that. When you look at this picture right here, you can see this right here. The neuron itself is this large cell in the picture. So this whole thing here is the neuron. So this is the neuron. And you can see in the middle of it, here's the little nucleus. There's little dots in here called Nissl bodies. You'll find that in the lab and stuff. There's these little branches that come off. So there's the ability to receive information, and there's the ability to send information back out. All of these little dots around it, these little purple dots here, these indicate the presence of those neuroglial cells. So those are like the nuclei of those, but that tells you that there's a bunch of other cells surrounding this, and you can kind of see the outlines of it, surrounding this neuron. So their job is going to be in some way to support that neuron and allow the neuron to do its job. We'll talk about that in great length. But first, we're going to kind of do some background information. So when we divide the nervous system down, there's two main divisions. Then you're going to find out there's subdivisions, and then there's subdivisions under that. So it gets really complex as far as the organization of it. But the two main divisions are the central nervous system, or what we call the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, also known as the PNS for short, because these are long terms. Central nervous system is pretty straightforward. This is the brain. This is the spinal cord. This is basically your control center. So everything that you do or need to do or that you determine from your environment is going to be directed towards the spinal cord, up the spinal cord into the brain, and then from the brain back down the spinal cord and then back out to other parts of the body. So this is why we call it the central nervous system. This is the game plan that's going on with your body. This is going to be the determination of it and controls everything that's going on. Peripheral nervous system is going to be everything that comes off of that. So you do have some direct nerves. You have some nerves that we call cranial nerves, and we're going to talk about all those, and you're going to need to know all of them. There's 12 pairs, but they come directly off the brain, and then they're going to feed things like primarily the head and the face, but they do go down into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity too. And then you have these others called spinal nerves, and those nerves come straight off the spinal cord. And there's a lot more than that. There's 32 pairs of those. But there's a lot of those that come off, and then they're going to either bring information in from outside the body. So like say you touch something, you touch your keyboard, you feel that sensation of touching that keyboard. That's bringing information in, and it comes in through eventually to the spinal nerves, to the spine, to the brain, and the brain processes all that information. Now I want to move those fingers to press those keys. I'm going to have to send that information back out to those muscles. So I have to come back from the brain, spinal cord, to the nerves, to the muscles, and say, this is how I want to make that action occur. So these are really important also. These cranial nerves and spinal nerves are the conduits between the central nervous system and every other part of your body that needs information. This picture over here, if you look at it, this is kind of a standardized view of a neuron. So this is the neuron right here. And we will talk about all these little things that you see in here. a little bit later on. Wow, that was bad handwriting. All right. Now, divisions and then subdivisions, right? I told you it gets smaller and smaller. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, which remember are made up of those cranial nerves and the peripheral nerves, right? So those two types of nerves that come off of the main central nervous system. These comprise then get broken down into smaller sections. So sensory versus motor. Sensory is receiving information. So I'm receiving information from somewhere. Touch, hot, cold, pain, muscle tension, something. I'm picking up sensory information and I'm bringing it into the central nervous system. So sensory brings towards the central nervous system. Motor division is taking information from the brain and spinal cord and bringing it back out. So motor is going to process information. That cup has some liquid in it, water in it. I want to drink that. So therefore, I need to coordinate the actions to do so. I have to, get my muscles to contract in my hand. I've got to bring it to my face. I have to, sip out of that cup. That's part of the motor division. What am I doing in response to what I've perceived? So sensory, picking up information, motor division, actually responding to things. So it's muscles, but don't forget about the glands. So glands are going to have to release a substance in response to things too. Like, you've got all kinds of things, adrenaline, growth hormone, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different substances, glands, sweating. That's an action too that has to occur. All right, and then we take the motor division and we make it smaller. So we're branching down. The motor division itself can be divided into two groups, the somatic and the autonomic. And I already told you in the last one when we were talking about muscles. Remember that autonomic is automatic. So always kind of put those two words together when you're thinking about it and you're trying to differentiate. The autonomic are things that you don't have conscious control over. So the smooth muscle of your GI tract, okay? Cardiac muscle, your heart, you don't have control over that. You can't tell your heart to pump or not to pump. The only control you have is like relaxation techniques or something to calm down or something. Also the actions of your glands. Is it time to release sweat? Is it time to release some sort of product that the gland makes, insulin, something this is part of that autonomic. You don't say, hey, my blood sugar feels a little high. I need to release some insulin at this point. This is all taken care of through that autonomic system. Somatic, on the other hand, this is that conscious control. So I make a conscious decision to move, to stand up. So at that point, I send information to the muscles, and the muscles go about contracting in response to that. So I have that control of saying, this is what I want to do now at this time. All right, so here we have it. So nervous system from the start, and we divided down into central nervous system, which was the spinal cord and the brain, right? Those two things only, so that makes that easy. And then the peripheral nervous system that we divided down into sensory and into motor. So this is reception, bringing stuff into the central nervous system. This is action, so taking stuff away from the nervous system. And then the motor nervous system, we have that autonomic, which is the automatic, not conscious control, and the somatic, which is conscious control. We will come back to those two in the next chapter. I think we might hit it at the end of this one, but it's definitely in the next chapter. All right, and there you go. Gray, central nervous system. Yellow, that was much better than my drawing. That's the peripheral nervous system. Notice you've got cranial nerves that come directly off the brain, and then you've got the spinal nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. So they're taking information away from the spinal cord or into the spinal cord, depending on what their job is. Same with the cranial nerves, by the way. All right, so looking here, so another way of looking at it, here's the central nervous system. We know that because that's the brain, that's the spinal cord. Information coming in is sensory, so I'm picking up heat, I'm picking up cold, I'm picking up touch. Like I said, it could be something just like the tension on your muscles. So if I want to move my arm, I need to know what position it currently is in so that I can make the appropriate adjustments to the tension of those muscles to figure out where I need to move my arm. So that's part of that sensory too. Always kind of figuring out where your body is at all times and what am I going to have to respond to. Motor division, notice, is coming out. So that is a response. So motor division is going to elicit some sort of response versus reception here, receiving information here. So somatic and autonomic, again, somatic is that voluntary, and the autonomic is that automatic. So it's not voluntary. Okay. It's something that your brain is going to automatically control and take over. Remember the GI tract when I talked about food moving through or water moving through your gastrointestinal system. Once you swallow, once you make that conscious decision with the skeletal muscle to chew up the food and then swallow the food, at that point it's being taken over by the smooth muscle, and you have peristalsis, and it just moves through on its own. It's not a part of that that conscious effort to get that food to move from the esophagus all the way through to the anus at the end. All right, so things that go wrong, which is always the case. If we got stuff that can go right, we got stuff that can go wrong, and this is one of those things. There's a difference, a huge difference between a migraine and a headache. And there's a big difference too between a migraine and a severely bad headache. A headache is just, it's a headache. And usually it's even on its worst, it can be a really bad headache. You can control it through muscle relaxation or through medications or something like that. Migraine is much, much worse than that. And a lot of times it's chronic. It's something that's going to keep coming back. And you just kind of sometimes don't even know when it is. But basically, your symptoms are not just the headache, the pounding head, but there's other physical symptoms that go along with that. So nausea, this problem with the periphery. And my husband suffers from these like periodically. So it's not often. It's not like just a headache that comes on, every now and then with the change of weather or something. He starts with this shimmery like images in the peripheral, and the peripheral is this outside. So this is my direct vision coming in, and then peripheral is this outside. And basically it's gonna this weird effects for him is coming in from this, and it brings his vision down to where it's a tunnel vision. He can only see in this straight ahead of him. He cannot see anything from the sides or whatever. His whole brain kind of shuts down to that. Another thing that happens is light and sound. So you have the severe intolerance of light or sound or anything like that. It just makes it really, really bad. I've had 2, I think, migraines in my entire life versus I have headaches all the time, which I just take care of with some Tylenol or something. But these migraines shut me down so bad that I would have to sit in a corner of my bed with the lights off. Couldn't lay down because that would make it hurt. I couldn't sit, move. I sat in a corner, like my bed up against the wall, corner up against that, braced against it until basically I think on one occasion I just threw up. Nausea was so bad I threw up, and it was just all over with. For each person, you've got different triggers. And if you've ever had it, you kind of start to figure out your triggers. Could be bright light, sudden bright light, flashing light, something like that just sends something in your brain overboard. There's certain foods that can trigger headaches and or migraines. So some people it's chocolate, caffeine, red wine. All 3 of my favorites right there. I've had to give up this one right there. Nuts, processed meats, because the different stuff they put in those processed meats, those sulfites and sulfates and whatever else that are in there, that can cause trigger a migraine off of that. It can be something like stress. I mean, things that would trigger normal headaches, but it might go to that extreme. Lack of sleep, because your brain isn't functioning properly if you're not getting enough sleep. Changes in altitude. You go high, you go low, you're getting more or less pressure and or oxygen quantity too. So sometimes that can trigger a migraine. Changes in barometric pressure. So stormy weather will change the barometric pressure outside, and that can trigger something like that too. And hormones are a huge one. We not that any of the rest of them are less likely to do that, but hormones are really big. I told you my husband suffers from them. 2 of my daughters also started suffering from them, and that was about the time that they hit puberty. They'd never had any migraine before that, but they hit puberty, and what's happening at puberty? A bunch of sex hormones are being released as they are growing into adulthood. And those hormones stimulated this bout with these migraines. And then once they got through that, for them, they were lucky. They really don't have this issue anymore. It kind of just was that time in their life. Not everybody is as lucky as that. So what's happening that causes a migraine, and what's happening that makes it different from a headache? This we've got these terms, these big long terms, of course. Cortical spreading depression. Basically, what's happening is, what they assume is happening here, and from tests and stuff, they're assuming is happening, is you get this stimulation going on in the brain, and it is a huge overaction of the brain, huge wave of excitation. When your brain gets a lot of action, sometimes it really doesn't know how to respond to things, and it usually responds to it in the form of pain. It says, hey, this is pain. When I don't know what's going on, this must be pain. And so you get that pain. There's this unresponsiveness. If I've got all of this action going on, it can't really focus on one thing or other things. So you do have this period of just like shutdown, responsive. Yes. Part of the brain that I think we'll come back to a little bit later, but this part of the brain that's called the trigeminal nucleus produces that pain. And that's where that's coming from, because you've got this blood flow that's unresponsive that has followed this period of too much stimulation that's gone on in the brain. And it's just, I don't know what to do. It's pain. And then there's, of course, treatments and stuff for that. You can have, it depends on what's causing it and what's going to be the long-term outcomes. If you're going to be somebody who has a migraine once every, few years or 10 years or something, probably not a lot, except at the time you might want to do something about it. But for people who have constant types of migraines, they're going to have, treatments that they're going to be using on a regular basis. But we do have little peptide things here, and you can see the whole name there. But a peptide is just a little protein. So this is a protein that really takes the neurotransmitters and makes them not get released. Remember that if I've got a nerve cell, you remember our nerve to muscle. So I had that nerve to muscle. Here's the end of my nerve cell. The information's coming in. It's got to jump that gap, right? It's the neurotransmitters that are going to be released into that synapse to stimulate the muscle. Same thing's going on with neurons. If this is a neuron and this is another neuron, I still have to have neurotransmitters in between that. Well, if I can block that release of those neurotransmitters, then that information is not going to be sent to the next relay, the next neuron, and so you won't feel that pain that's coming on in there. It's just kind of stop all this action in there by not allowing that information to be passed along. Antidepressants can help. Anticonvulsants can help. That would be more on a chronic type of issue there, where they need to have a daily regimen that keeps it from happening. All right, general functions. We have to figure out what's going on in our environment. That might be internal environment. That means you're inside your body, like your heart rate, your stomach, you feel pain in your stomach, or you've got digestive issues, or you've just got blood pressure that you have to monitor. But we have to figure out that's called the internal environment. So we have to figure out what's going on in the internal. It might be part of the external environment. I touch something. Is that something that's solid? Is it liquid? Is it hot? Is it cold? What is it? Or I see something, or I hear something. All of that goes back to receiving information, and that's all part of your sensory function. So we have a lot of nerve cells that are dedicated to all of those specific things. Think about that. Sight, hearing, smell, taste. Those are your special senses. But then you've got touch, you've got hot, you've got cold, you've got pain, you've got really burning sensations. We've got all kinds of things that we have to pick up on and then relay that information to the brain. So from the sensory function, receiving the stimulus, I then send that information to the spinal cord in the brain, the central nervous system, and we have to integrate that. So it's an integrative function, but we have to integrate that information. That means I have to register it, pain. I have to interpret it. So I get the sensation right to my brain, but then I have to interpret and say that is painful. What kind of pain is it? Is it a sharp pain? Is it a burning pain or whatever? So the brain has to integrate that. And then you also have to make a response to that. I have to decide what I'm going to do. Is it something like pain where I need to react to it right now? Or is it something like, I see something like the TV's going on in the background or something, and I really just can ignore it at this time. So you're kind of making this series of steps through there too. I'm not just receiving the information and determining what it is. I'm making all kinds of decisions about that too. That leads you to the reaction. Once I've made a decision, I have to have some sort of reaction. It can be as simple as ignoring it. I'm not even going to do anything about it. Or I can have an action. So that's the action part. So the motor function is going to send information out. So this goes to the central nervous system, and this one goes away from the central nervous system, back out again to muscles and glands. All right, so let's start with sensory, and I gave you some background on that. We have a huge number of different types of receptors, and they're in certain areas. So all your body's going to have receptors, but you do have a larger concentration of receptors in certain areas. Your hands, you do a lot of, where's my fingers? You do a lot of touching your environment and exploring your environment and manipulation, just holding the pen right here and stuff. So I have a lot more sensory receptors right here in my fingertips than I do further up, like my arm right here. You can do this little simple touch thing where you close your eyes and you get somebody else to touch it. If you put 2 pinpoints right here on your fingertip with your eyes closed, you can distinguish between those 2 points at a very, very close distance between them. So I can say, hey, you touched me in 2 points, and there's really almost no space there. But if you do that on your arm, it feels like one spot's being stimulated. When you get further apart, it takes quite a bit of distance actually for you to figure out that there's 2 points being stimulated. And you can't really tell that with your eyes shut. Well, and it makes sense. I use my fingers a lot for exploration. I really don't touch things with my forearm, so it really doesn't need a bunch of really close sensory receptors in this area. We're going to have fewer, and they're going to service a much larger area than something that requires a lot more denseness and a lot more individual nerve cell receptors going on in there. But you'll have a whole bunch of different types. I was talking about light touch, but there'll be pain, there's pressure, there's all kinds of sensory receptors in there too. And then, of course, you've got the special senses. So that any one of those sensory receptors, they're specialized. They're going to gather information, but they're going to be specific as to what information they actually work with and what they can gather. Pain receptor cannot do double duty on pressure or double duty on light touch. Okay, that's other guys doing their job. All right, and then they take that information, they send it to the central nervous system, because the next spot then, right here's my receptor on my finger. Send that in, so that information goes in towards the spine, up through relay stations to the brain, processed central nervous system, because that's where the processing goes. Was it painful? Was it tolerable if it was painful? What kind of pain was it? Or was it just simply, I touched my blanket and it was soft? It can be all kinds of stuff. It doesn't have to be the bad, negative sort of connotations there. Although that's important, that's safety for your body and your tissues. So that brings us to the integrative. Once it hits the central nervous system, we're going to have the integrative function: sensation, memories, thoughts, and decisions. And this is a lot of what we're going to be spending on the next chapter too, specifically on what's the difference between a perception and a sensation. Sensation is, I can get the feeling. So if I touch something, I can get the feeling and I can get it to my brain, but my brain has to interpret that. Is it soft? Is it warm? Is it, what I would consider cozy or something? That, that's a sensation that you have put based off of memory and likability or something too, also to that you have associated with that touch. And that brings us to memories. Memories are stored portions in those neurons that elicit some sort of chemical reaction that says, I remember this, or I might have to make a new memory of this. I've never come in contact with this before. I've never tasted this before. I've never seen this before. So it's time to make a new memory of it. So it's constantly building memories or accessing previously stored memories. Thoughts, it's easy to say, what are your thoughts about this? But your real thoughts, your brain is constantly processing all this information and creating this load of information that you then have to access and make into some sort of reality. And that's your thoughts, your brain working on that. And it might be something that you verbalized, there's a whole set of muscles there for that. Or it might be something that, you know, your just brain is working through at the time. And then decision making. Am I going to, excuse me, am I going to react to this? If so, how am I going to do it? Your decision may be not to react at all, but it may be something that I need to move my arm, move my leg, move away, or grasp it, or do something. So you have to make that decision as to how it is you're going to respond to all of these things that you just got up through in there, your response to that. And if you're going to make a response, that's part of that motor function. So my decision of how I interpreted that information that came in, those sensations that came in, the sensory information that came in, what am I doing to act on it? Okay. And that's going to require information going from the central nervous system back out to specific muscles, glands, whatever, to make an action. And here you can see in black, these are the nerve. Remember our motor units we were talking about? Here's a motor unit. Here's that motor end plate right here, and these are skeletal muscle cells that you see in that diagram there. So that information is going to come down through those nerve cells, end up here with the synapse, and then tell that muscle fiber it's time to contract if it gets that information. All right, so the first thing I talked about a little bit was about the neurons themselves. What are the different neurons and everything, size, shape, and all that. Remember that I showed you, I think it was probably this picture even, you have this kind of general shape here. So I have this cell, and it has all of these branches that are coming off, and then you have this one long one, and you can see it splits here. This is kind of what we call our standardized neuron. And it's standardized because it's what most of your neurons look like, but it's not what all your neurons. Remember, the neurons are the workhorses, so I'm not talking about neuroglial cells yet. I'm just talking about neurons themselves. So most of them are going to look like this specific shape right here, and when we look at it in lab, that's what you're going to study, really, is this shape, because like 98% or something astronomical are these, but they're not all of them. Okay, so we'll look at some other shapes in there too. So they do differ in length, they do differ in size, how many axons they have. The majority have this one axon that may branch like this. They do branch actually in the end. With their dendrites, so these little guys coming in right here, these little branches, those are dendrites, those receive information. So how many of those do they have, and what do they look like? So all of that's going to vary. I'm going to go back to this, by the way. They're amitotic. If I put a or an in front of any word that makes it not or without, it's a negative. And if you remember, what does mitosis mean? Mitosis means to divide. So these guys do not divide, okay? Which brings up an interesting point. If nerve cells don't divide, they divide at the beginning, but once they specialize, they don't divide, okay? So they go through all that tissue division when you're an embryo and fetus and everything, and then you differentiate and you make brain cells, nerve cells, and all of that. After that point, once they become that brain cell, that nerve cell, spinal cell, then they don't divide anymore. So that becomes a problem. If you lose them, can you ever replace them? In most cases, that's a big no. There's some more recent research that shows that in some places that might not, this might not always be the case, but for our intents and purposes, we're going to go with no. Once you've lost the brain cell, it's gone. So destroying those brain cells can be a problem. It also brings up this problem with cancer, because cancer really is an overproduction of cells, right? So how is it that you get cancer in the brain if those cells can no longer divide? I can't make more cells, so they can't become cancerous, right? It's not the neurons themselves. It's going to be the neuroglial cells that are the part of that cancerous portion. So remember, we do have other cells that are part of the nervous system. It's not just the neuron. So those neuroglial cells have a very important function with support and protection and all kinds of stuff for the neurons. They're also the ones that can still divide. So if they can still divide, they're the ones that could potentially become cancerous if in an individual, if they go rogue. All right. Now, going back to neurons. Neurons also have a very high metabolic rate, which means they use a lot of energy. So you're going to see associated with that a lot of mitochondria, because they're going to need a lot of ATP. They're using energy a lot. Your brain is a huge hog on the amount of glucose that comes in. Some huge amount, like just, I can't remember, for your brain itself. Over 20% of all glucose is just used in your brain itself. Forget the rest of your body and your organs and everything. It's a huge hog on that. But think about the importance of it. Really does need to be going through actions all of the time. All right, every neuron, even if it doesn't have the shape I'm showing you over here, every neuron has three basic parts: dendrites, cell body, and axon. And so we're going to talk about those things. All right, the portion right here that you see right here that looks like a cell, and you take all those little extra things off, that's the cell body. So we have the cell body, which is like a normal cell, and it has a nucleus in the center. Then you have these projections coming off, and you can see that there's quite a few here. Those are called the dendrites. Dendrites' function is to receive information. So any information that's coming in from the outside, whether it's outside your body, whether it's from another neuron, wherever it's coming from, is coming in through the dendrites. So the dendrites receive it, and then they direct that information to the cell body. The cell body then directs that information out in most neurons. This one single axon right here that then sends it out, and it may send it out to another neuron. It may send the information to a muscle cell, gland, or something. Whatever it's doing, it's sending the information that way. So it's this direction in through the dendrites to the cell body, from the cell body down the axon. And then once it reaches these little tips, that's where we talked about, like a muscle cell would be right there or something, maybe another neuron. But this is that synapse, okay? And then it's transmission of that information to the next cell. All right, if you notice this portion, the body and the dendrites, they have this gray color, and there's a reason why. It's not just for diagram purposes. They are actually gray, okay? They have this grayish color to them. We call them gray matter, so they do the diagrams that way. This is because they're missing something. They don't have this thing we call myelination. Myelination, see, unmyelinated there. Myelination is this covering like this right here in this yellowish. We call it white, but it's this yellowish in this diagram. That is like, it's a fatty substance. So myelination is like a fatty type of insulation around these neurons, and it does a couple things. Think about a cord from anything that we have that's electrical. The insulation is going to keep that information from like dispersing away. It keeps it going in one direction down. It's also going to help in the case of these neurons to speed up your rate of impulse. So as fast as an impulse and electrical activity can pass through this neuron, the myelination right there, the white matter on this, that allows that impulse to go even faster. And these tracks, these are called our fiber tracks, okay? This gray, that's the cell body and the dendrites. And I will spend more time talking about myelination. Myelination, remember, is that coating around the neuron. So this yellow in this picture right here that says axon, that's actually the nerve fiber. So this is your nerve fiber right here, your neuron, and the axon or whatever, this one's the axon. The myelination is this series of strips that you see all that in layers all the way around it, this sheath of a fat-based substance. That sheath allows for information to run faster down the neuron, okay? So in certain diseases, and there's quite a few out there, ALS is one of those, but multiple sclerosis is another one. This means multiple means many, sclerosis means scars, okay? And really what it is a stripping of this myelin. So where you have this myelin, it's an autoimmune disease, basically, where your blood cells are stripping away. They're tearing down that myelin. And what's the job of the myelin? It's to speed up the response. So if you're missing the myelin, what's going to happen to the speed of your responses? They're going to slow down. So it reduces the rate of that impulse moving down that fiber. So if I've got fibers coming down to my muscles here, and I'm supposed to be transmitting these at a certain rate, and now I'm slowing down that action, you're going to see problems with muscle movement. A lot of people who first start to notice symptoms of multiple sclerosis, The things that they notice first: suddenly you're tripping, you're not getting your foot out in front of you, and they're like, I'm klutzy. My aunt has multiple sclerosis, and she said the thing she noticed was like putting on eye makeup and stuff. Or she would lose control of her hand and it would draw out. She had no idea what was going on. She would be tripping over things. She's like, dang, I got really klutzy, and didn't know what was going on. Well, the problem is you're sending information to the muscles, but where you've got this planned movement. So think about taking one step after another step after another step. You're not getting information to that muscle in time. So those muscles aren't contracting at the rate that they need to contract to make that smooth movement. So you're not getting to that point. Supposed to be putting my foot down and supporting my weight, but it's not getting that information fast enough. And it's just milliseconds, and you don't have that coordinated action there. And then that can progress to other things. So you'll see any sort of actions that are required by the nervous system to be affected. So blurred vision is a symptom. Obviously numb legs and arms because of the movement in the muscles, but it can be, incontinence and problems with other types of muscular actions in the body too. And here's a nice picture here. This is nice, healthy myelin, and notice there's a gap here. That gap's supposed to be there, but it's still a solid little sheet in here. Whereas in multiple sclerosis, you see these long sections of exposed axon that's in there, so that nerve impulse is having to actually travel down that axon like that. Usually with diagnosis, it comes with those symptoms. I am now very klutzy. I can't see as well. Something's happening, and the doctor starts making a presumptive diagnosis based off of your symptoms. They can do MRIs and they can track the scars over a repeated period of time, but usually the first thing is you have this series of symptoms. So most likely we're going to assume that this is what's happening to you. And they may do something like a lumbar puncture to get some fluids and look at the fluids. It's really kind of, just like every disease, it's pretty tragic. It's usually between the ages of 20 and 40 that you see the onset of these symptoms, and diagnosis is set by that time. So somebody in their 20s with somebody in their 40s. We had this girl at my school last year. She was 16, 17, probably 17. I think she was a senior. She started having these problems where she was falling. She fell out of her chair one time. She wasn't in my class, but she was in my classroom. Another teacher was teaching in my room at the time, and I happened to be standing there, and she just fell out of her chair. And she was having all these symptoms. They didn't know what it was. Well, it turns out she's got multiple sclerosis. So even before the age of 20, she was showing pretty progressive symptoms. So outcome on that was not very positive on that. But you can see how young it can be affected. And we have no cure. So there's not something that we can come back and say, hey, we're going to give you this set of medications and it's all going to go away. All they can do is try and help with the symptoms and maybe slow down some of those symptoms. But the progression is still going to progress. Now, individuals react differently. My aunt that I told you about has a very, she was diagnosed in her 30s, and she's 8 to 10 years older than me, maybe 12 years older than me. She's not that much older than me, but she's had, it hasn't been easy, but she's had a very mild progression of multiple sclerosis compared to other people. So she has to take naps during the day. She can't drive because you lose the muscle control, and she has these restrictions on her life, but she has still maintained a semblance of life. And she's a journalist, so she can work from home pretty much too. But like the other girl I was talking about, she had very severe symptoms from a very pretty early age in there. So she's probably got a very quick progression that is not going to have as good an outcome. Notice that it's primarily in women and Caucasians, but that doesn't mean that men or non-Caucasians would not be affected by this. You do see it across different genders and different races. Development. Where did it come from? What's sparking this in an individual? It's some sort of autoimmune disease where the immune system is attacking the myelin sheath, but really we don't know what started the whole thing. There's been several different researches and publications and stuff where they come out with this as the possible thing, but they haven't really settled in on anything. We do know that it is an immune system, so something along the T cells are being stimulated to attack the myelin. But why? Is it a viral infection that happened that, most people would have got over, but this person, it caused, their immune system to act funny? Was it a virus that we don't know? It's really kind of unknown at this point. And you do see a lot of treatments that are along the medical line, like trying to decrease the incontinence, the bladder spasms, antidepressants for the individual, steroids, long-term drugs. And then you also see a lot of holistic type of medication stuff. I've heard about things like bee sting therapy was a thing for a while, where you would get bee stings in the neck or something that was supposed to stop the immune system from doing that. But I think that's kind of fallen out of favor again. All right, going back online. Classification of our neurons and revisiting these little cells called the neuroglial cells. Neurons do vary in their function. So remember, we've already stated this. They can be sensory, so that means they're bringing information towards the central nervous system. They can be motor, which means they're bringing information away from the central nervous system, or they can be part of that integrative function with the memories and the processing and all of that in there. So you do have different neurons with different jobs. Even with the sensory, we got neurons with a whole bunch of different jobs. You've got, neurons that have to see are going to be different than neurons that are going to have to bring in information about smell or taste, and definitely different information about touch and pain and pressure and that kind of stuff. So you have a lot of specialization going on in those sensory neurons there. They vary in size. Again, that goes back to their function. What are they going to do? So how many axons, how many dendrites, what's their job in there? This is our standardized in this picture, but it is not the only type of neuron in there. But we can start classifying them. So we have bipolar, bi means two, unipolar, uni means one, and multipolar, multi means many. So let's talk about those three different groups of neurons. Bipolar, again, that means two. So what they end up having is two processes. Here's the cell body right here. So they still have a cell body with the nucleus in it, but notice it's different. From the cell body, you don't have all of those little projections coming off. You really just have one. It may branch, you can see the branching, but the information comes in through the dendrites to the cell body on this one process, not all of those other processes that I showed you in the previous picture, and then gets directed through the cell body and then out that axon. These are very, very specific. These are specialized types of neurons, okay? You find these only in our special senses. Sight, the eyes, sorry. Hearing, the ears, and nose for olfactory, for smell, okay? So those are the only places you're going to see that. Not very common, only found in the face, right? So only these specialized type of senses in the face. Unipolar, uni means one, okay? So unipolar, extra things on there, means one process. So you can look here, we can still divide it down between what's called a dendrite and an axon, but notice the dendrite comes in and it just becomes, it's continuous with the axon. The cell body is off to the side, so really that information doesn't travel through the cell body like in the others. It just comes down the dendrite and gets continuously sent through that axon till it reaches that endpoint there for the next one, okay? So these are part of our peripheral nervous system in here, and I'm going to talk about these. What we really, I'll come back to that term later, but think about peripheral nervous system and sensory. So this is our information coming in from, from outside of the central nervous system. So it could be external types of things like, touch, hot, cold, that kind of stuff. Or it could be this sensory from inside your body that's going towards the central nervous system. Gastrointestinal distress is the one you probably are familiar with. Heart attack would be another one. But those are the negative ones. You have daily things that go on in there that are part of that too. All right, and then multipolar. Multi means many. This is, I told you it was something huge. 99% of all neurons. It is the standardized one. This is the one we'll learn and spend a lot of time on and focus on. This is the one that is most of our neurons. So it has a cell body, just like the others do, but it has multiple dendrites coming into that cell body. So we have multiple points of entry. You can pick up information from all kinds of points, bring it into the centralized location of the cell body, and then direct it out through one axon. So many processes, most of which are the dendrites, with one axon leading away from it. So bring in a lot of information, pull it together, and send it out one way. Okay. So when we're talking about the central nervous system, this is the most of the neurons in there. So it's going to have a lot to do with things like motor, okay, coming from an integrative. Okay, so our integrative functions in the central nervous system in the brain and spinal cord, but also there's information coming out from the central nervous system with motor. All right, sensory, more terms, always terms, right? So our sensory have a term that describes them. We call that, it's really called afferent, but there's another one called efferent. Sound the same, afferent. So I really usually stress it so that you guys can make a sound sort of thing in your head. These are afferent. Okay, so a with an a at the beginning. Afferent. So anything that's sensory is coming from this external, outside of the central nervous system, and it's going towards the central nervous system. So that means it's going to be sensory. So here's my sensory receptors picking up the information. They send that information down, and then it's going to be picked up in the central nervous system. The dotted line is telling you the difference between peripheral and central. Notice the cell body. See it off to the side? What kind of neuron is that? If you said unipolar, you are correct. Now, we do have those special ones in the face associated with your special senses that would be bipolar. So sensory, most of them are unipolar. You do have those few specialized ones that are bipolar, but this would be like from your body somewhere. Notice that it is a unipolar neuron. This right here, what you see here, the end of this one and the beginning of the next one, that spot is a synapse. So this is, we're going to come back to that in a little while. That's where you got to transfer electrical information to chemical information to get to the next one. So once the sensory brings it in, then we have to do something with that. So it's bringing it into the spinal cord, which will then direct it to the brain. So that's where, when I say bring it in, that's where we're going with it. Interneurons are in between. They link sensory to motor, but notice it's not just one in between those two. You have several in there. We're going to have several going up the spinal cord. You've got a whole bunch going on in the brain between figuring out what that impulse is that just came in, what that sensation is, accessing memories, accessing thoughts, decision making, and then sending information back out. You know, do I want to respond to that? So there's a whole bunch of interneurons that are going to be involved in that entire integrative process in there, but they're kind of linked in between. So they link between sensory and motor. Okay, so this would be spinal cord and this would be brain in there. There they are, interneurons. Look at their shape. What does their shape look like? If you said multipolar, you were correct. Okay. These have multiple branches, so multiple dendrites and one axon, and then the next one has the same thing, and then it's going out again. These are all going to be in the central nervous system because they're all part of that integrative function. Okay, so integrative as far as processing the information that's coming in from the sensory, and then, you know, determining decision making from there. And that decision making is going to lead to an action possibly. So if it does lead to an action, it might be a dead end, you might just ignore it completely. But if it does lead to an action, then you're going to have to send information back out to muscle or a gland. So that's part of the motor neuron. And notice again, that motor neuron has multiple dendrites and one axon, so it is also multipolar. Remember, I told you most of your nerve cells are going to be multipolar. The central nervous system interneurons are, but so are your motor neurons are going to be multipolar too. So they carry impulses away from the central nervous system out to another, here's another term, something called an effector. An effector gets an effect from these. So this would be your muscle is an effector, a gland is an effector, something that responds to the impulse from this motor neuron, that is an effector. So remember I told you that information coming in from sensory is afferent. Well, information that's going away from the central nervous system is efferent. Again, it's efferent, but efferent. Okay, so Afferent is sensory, efferent is motor. And you can see the terms right there. So keep those in mind, okay? All right, neuroglial cells. There's a bunch of different types of neuroglial cells, and they all have their little function. You see some in the peripheral nervous system, you see some in the central nervous system. So let's start with peripheral first. Schwann cells are those cells that produce the all-important myelin. And remember, myelin is that insulation, that fatty substance that helps speed up the impulse speed going down an axon. So that is really important. And the Schwann cells are the guys that produce that. So they're going to lay that down on those axons, okay? Help speed up that neurotransmission. In peripheral, by the way, we're in peripheral right now, so I'll give you something different on central. All right, satellite cells. Satellite cells, these guys, just like the satellite, kind of extra out there, they support the neuron bodies. Basically, what they're going to do is going to check the chemical environment around the neurons. Neurons work by having ions moving in and out. You've got the sodium and this potassium moving in and out of those nerve cells. That means the chemical environment, the positive negative interaction has to be perfect for these guys to work. It is the job of the satellite cells to kind of monitor that environment and adjust that environment so that it is good and healthy for those nerve cells to work. Okay, micro means small, so microglia, there's your glial cells there. We're in central nervous system, by the way. Now we've moved to the brain and spinal cord, central nervous system. Microglia cells are found only in the central nervous system. They are the little guys that run around and mop up or clean up the environment. So they're kind of mop up things that shouldn't be there. We call them phagocytic. Phago means to eat. Cytic means cell. So these guys are cells that eat other things, and specifically what they're trying to eat are things that could cause damage to your central nervous system. So they're cleaning up bacteria, viruses, fungus, whatever. Their job is to patrol and get rid of those things. A phagocytic cell, you have a lot of white blood cells that are phagocytic. These guys are dedicated immune cells to the central nervous system, to those cells themselves, so that they can protect the environment of the central nervous system. Last thing you want is some sort of infection on the brain or the spinal cord. And then also in the central nervous system, we have these little things called astrocytes. Astro means star, so they're star-shaped. I personally think the microglia are star-shaped too, but these guys have this, little radiate out sort of star shape going on in there. They basically are also a cleanup crew, so they're going to look at the ion environment. Remember I talked about, going back here, this one, in the peripheral nervous system, the satellite, they control that chemical environment, right? Well, the astrocytes are kind of the same thing for the central nervous system. So they go through and they mop up any excess ions so that the chemical environment and the ionic environment around your neurons are going to be in the right shape so that you can appropriately send and receive those signals. They also help with that synapse. So they're going to allow that synapse to form that allows the transduction of information from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell. So across that gap, remember that chemical gap? So their job is to make that synapse in there. And then they also allow for the nutrients to be provided to they have a big role here, to those neurons by allowing for blood vessels to bring in the appropriate nutrients and oxygen, and then take waste products away from the neurons so that they're healthy and they remain healthy and they have everything they need to do their job. Then we have this one. I love this name. Oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocyte are the Schwann cells of the central nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells' job was to lay down myelin. In the central nervous system, the oligodendrocytes do the same thing. So their job is to myelinate those cells. So different cells, same job, but it's just by location. Since it's a different area, has different layers of protection, you have a different cell that has to do that job. So again, these guys do the same job, they're just slightly different cells. And then the last little group here in the central nervous system, what we call the ependymal cells or ependyma cells. Ependymal cells are these little cells, you can see here, they have a little base, and they have, importantly, they've got these little hair-like structures right here that are called cilia. And their job is to kind of wave and pass fluids and sort of move the fluids around in the central nervous system, specifically the canal. So we have that CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, that's moving around the brain and parts of the brain inside of it, and around the spinal cord. These little ependymal cells keep that fluid moving. So they're going to kind of wave basically and move that fluid around. Okay. And like I said, it's also in the brain, that's around the outside of the brain, but these little gaps inside the brain, that's called the ventricles. Keep that movement of that fluid. And here's some pictures. So you can see here, here's where the CSF would be, right here in this area right in here, and then you can see the ependymal cells with their little cilia right there, all lining that and keeping that fluid moving around. You got astrocytes and microglial cells. Here's the neuron. Notice the neurons are much bigger. There's an astrocyte connecting the blood vessel to the neuron, so allowing for that nutrient to be present for the neurons in there. Here's the oligodendrocyte. So this is central nervous system, by the way, if you didn't catch it from the other cells. Laying down the Schwann, not laying down the Schwann cells, laying down the myelin like the Schwann cells would do in the peripheral nervous system. So those are both oligodendrocytes there. So these are all, this specifically is central. This one shows you, this picture shows you some others. So again, we have a lot of central nervous system ones, but I've got Schwann cell in here. You can notice the long nerve fiber too. So that would be these two, this one, and then I think this one, yeah, satellite cells. These are all peripheral in here, whereas A through D is central. And then the last thing for this particular PowerPoint is regeneration of a nerve axon. Remember, you can't rebuild a nerve cell. Nerve cell dies, it's gone. But that also would cause a problem. So if you have in our peripheral, so say like a nerve going from your fingertip to, bleeding information to your spinal cord towards your central nervous system, or coming out again, like a motor going to those muscles, we get damage all the time. Think about all the cuts you've had on your fingers and stuff all your life, the burns you've had. You're doing damage to those nerve cells. It wouldn't take very many years into your life before you would have so much nerve damage that you couldn't use your fingers or your arms or something like that. So we can't regenerate the entire cell. You can't replace a cell, but you can repair the axon. So if I came in and I had like a cut done to my finger, some cuts are, just too much damage, but the cutting the nerve cell. So I've got this little cut right here. There is a process of actually degenerating that and then repairing that nerve cell. So that at some point you receive that information to that muscle fiber again. So, there is a regeneration process, but notice that the cell bodies are still intact. Okay, so as long as the cell bodies are still intact, you can help regenerate those neurons. It depends on the depth and stuff. So if some of you have had like really big scars, like I've got a scar from my C-section, or you've had some surgery or something, it doesn't always come back fully. You've got this weird sensation. You touch that scar, you touch that area, and it's like it doesn't really feel the same as the other. So you're not getting the same sensation if it's a really deep type of wound that was recovered, but you do get sensation back. So we do have the ability to repair. It's just not always, like 100% of everything. But again, you would have to, because we would lose all sensation and all ability to control our muscles within a few years of our life, probably first decade or so. And that's going to be it for today. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye.